Hey everybody, welcome to Views on View. Today on our panel, we have Chris Fritz, who is one of the core team members of View. Should I redo that?
Even though you find it laughable. No, this is fine. This is good.
You just interjected me.
Well, normally people say hi. It's okay. This is fine.
Hey folks, I just want to let you know quickly about Netlify. Netlify is a really cool system for hosting what are traditionally known as static sites. However, the real benefit that I've been finding is that I don't have to mess with a back end. I can just set things up. I build the website out. I've been using a system called 11DJS, and you just deploy it. And then anything that you have that you want to do, you can do on the front end. So if you want to pull in some kind of database with Firebase or something else, if you want to collect form data, Netlify provides all kinds of services that make it easy to do all that stuff. If you're trying to do serverless, they have a really, really neat serverless setup that will allow you to deploy your websites without having to deploy a back end, and it'll do some of the work for you. I just love it. So if you're looking for a way that you can actually deploy a website that only has front-end technology in it, gives you all the tools that you typically need for the back end without having to actually program the back end, then give them a try. Go check them out at netlify.com.
We're doing a great episode so far. Let's move on. Let's get started.
Yeah, let's do it.
So what are we talking about today?
So we decided, since we without a guest today, it's just Chris and I, it's the Chris and Divya show. We're going to talk about input mask.
Chris and Divya show.
Yes. Yeah, we need music for that.
I just provided music.
Oh, I thought that was just one example of music.
I thought that was good for the final. Yeah, I mean, it's okay. I mean, we can workshop it later, but anyway, so we wanted to talk about input masks.
Yes.
So first, like, what is an input mask? Is this like something you wear to like a party or something like that?
A masquerade? I mean, I'm sure you could figure something out, but the idea of an input mask is that it works with inputs. So if you have a form element, you've definitely come across this if you've filled out a form online. So you have this input, and then within it, you might fill in credit card information, for example. And when you fill the information out, it formats it so it looks like a credit card number.
So with like spaces between every four numbers?
So it gives you spaces between four numbers. And it's the same with like phone numbers as well. So you have the spacing for, if you're a US-based number, you have the area code followed by 3 digits and 4 digits. And so it's the idea of masking the content of your input so it looks like the actual content it represents. And so it's a little bit more readable and understandable than just having a string of numbers.
And so with a phone number, it'd be like automatically adding the parentheses and maybe like a dash or something like that.
Yeah, depending on the input mask. I've seen some where they just give you the appropriate spacing. I've seen those where there is the parentheses added. It usually depends on the library or the author that is creating this input mask. But essentially the idea is that you're making the input readable to the user. So they don't have to keep checking back on like, oh, did I fill this out correctly? Because it's to just parse the information.
So they, like for a phone number, for example, they can easily see that they have the right amount of numbers.
Exactly, yeah.
Same for a credit card, like they didn't miss one.
Yeah, exactly. And so you don't have to do the counting, you don't have to do that. And then you're like behind the scenes, your machine still knows, or like the browser still knows that those numbers exist without the formatting, because browsers don't need that. But humans do.
So it's kind of normalized, that like the input is normalized client side?
Yes, exactly.
Cool. So why would you want to do this?
The main reason to do it is just purely for usability. Like we were talking about earlier, just because from a user's perspective, filling out a form isn't always fun. It's kind of boring. And you want to make the form filling process as quick and efficient as possible. So if someone was checking out, you want to make sure their checkout process is as quick and efficient. You get all of the details that you need accurately and efficiently as possible. And so with input masking, you can easily do that because all you need is maybe an address. You can format that address properly. You might need like a phone number, maybe you might need a credit card information and so on. And so you need those pieces. And if you have the input masking to help the user parse that quickly, then they can efficiently check out quickly. And so specifically for checkout processes, there is a conversion there's like a revenue conversion, right? Because if someone checks out, it means money gets transferred and so on. So there is a benefit from that perspective. in other cases, it might not exactly be a revenue specific benefit, but there can be times where, let's say you're trying to have a user sign up to your service and you want them to sign up for a service. I've come across sign up flows where I just get frustrated with the process because either the form input looks kind of weird and wacky and I don't know what I'm doing. And then sometimes the error, the form validation doesn't work. And so I just end up not signing up for the thing and not completing the process altogether. Okay. So I think the idea of form inputs is just to help with usability, with the understanding of the benefit of people completing the forms at the end.
So it gives you kind of like on the fly visual self-validation, like the users are looking at this to see like, okay, does this look right?
Yeah. Yeah. Because commonly when you fill something out, like I've come across it where I would fill out, let's say for the US, that's not usually a problem. But if I were using a service that was international, you sometimes have to add like the country code. And I'm not used to adding that. And so I would just use like US number, whatever. And then if there was form validation, I would see clearly that the number of numbers or the quantity of numbers doesn't accurately match what was expected. So I know that I have to add the country code in just because of how it looks, rather than like submitting the form and then there'll be like error, phone number invalid, and I wouldn't know why.
Yeah, that's a great point. I feel like I have a lot more confidence with input masks because like you talked about with a country code, like sometimes I'm even wondering, like, do I add a country code or am I going to break something in a database somewhere and then I'll never get it?
Exactly. And usually with country codes also symbols might come in. So
and do I add a plus?
Do you add a plus? Do you not? And so, that's always something with an input mask, it takes away that question altogether. So the user knows exactly what to input without guessing.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a really good point. So in terms of like doing this kind of thing in Vue, like you've done this kind of thing in Vue, right?
Yes, I have.
And like, how did you do it? Like, what kind of features did you use? Like, what do people have to know?
So there's different ways that you can do it. You can use, I was talking to Sarah Drasner like last year about this, but you can use filters using Vue. I don't think that's a recommended thing to do. But one other way that I've done it is using computed properties. So you can easily grab like the data value and then change it so that the user sees a specific thing versus like what the data property actually is. You capture the original number and then you still reflect like a formatted number to the user. So you have almost like the way I've done it before is you have two properties. You have like an original and then you have a formatted. And so when you need to send it to an API, you can use the original, which is unformatted. And what you show the user is the formatted number. And you can do that switching on the fly as users type in. So you would just capture that at input. Like whenever a new input is added in, you would just make the change.
So, and how do you make it so that like in an input, like there's not a way, like an HTML input I'm thinking about, that there's not a way to have like a parenthesis show up, but it's not really part of it?
Yeah.
How do we do that part?
The idea of the parentheses. Like
for a phone number and stuff. Like, how do you have stuff that shows up in the input but isn't provided by the user and can't be edited by the user?
Usually, it depends on you have to capture the type of input, right? So if it is, let's say if someone were using your library that you created for input masking, you would have to specify like what kind of type, like data type it is. So if it's a credit card number, in this case, it's a phone number. So if it's a phone number, there's like a different function that you use where you add that. You use like some kind of regex on the back end, not really back end, but behind the scenes. You use a regex where you're grabbing the first three numbers and then adding that parentheses. So as a user types, it grabs the first three, adds parentheses, and then so on.
So it's basically making like a regular input, but automatically changing the stuff that users are adding?
Yeah, that's what I've done in the past, where it is included in the input itself, or you see it as you're typing. But the user isn't inputting that value itself. And so the idea is that the parentheses exist and you see it in the input, but because you capture the original value based on what they type. So you can capture key events. So whenever a user types a specific number, you just capture those events and then you save them because they're specific numbers. And then you would be able to have like the idea of what the original input is versus the formatted. I feel like this is very fuzzy. Like I want to show like actual code to explain what I mean.
We can drop you have some code, and I think you have a talk on forms in general too that
yes, I do, yeah.
That I think would be good to drop in the show notes.
Yes, we can definitely do that.
Yeah, without diving into really specific code and to sort of mirror what you said a little bit, it sounds like one way of doing it is having an input, and the computed property, if there are like a certain number of digits, can automatically like add parentheses to the value of the input.
Yeah.
Like for the user.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so how do you manage like where a user's cursor is and stuff like that?
Yeah, that one is a hard one. I don't know if I've specifically solved that. So I'm going to like deviate from that question a little bit because it's slightly related. But one thing that I found when I did input masking in the past is the position of cursor based on whether or not a user arrow key. So, sometimes you command arrow to like the end or the front of an input, which is nice because then you can quickly just navigate to be like, oh, I missed a number or whatever. Capturing that is really difficult because you almost need to check. I think there's a browser way where you can check where exactly a cursor is. And I forget exactly how to do that.
Yeah, I think it's like with get selection or something like that.
Yeah, it was like get selection and then it gives you an index. And then you can figure out if it's like where exactly it is and then move the cursor appropriately.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly what that is, but we'll drop that API in the show notes.
Yeah, but the thing is, when you manipulate that, it can be fuzzy. It can give you results that are unexpected. So I've done like cursor manipulation, and sometimes it just jumps the number. So if I was like, oh, I'm typing in a number, it just jumps the cursor either to the front. Like for instance, one issue I had was that I would type in, let's say, a phone number, and so you're typing in a phone number. And then it automatically jumps the cursor after you type in the first 3 to the front of the input because I changed the input on the fly.
Which is why sometimes you'll want to like change the input.
Exactly. Yeah.
Or change where the cursor is in the input.
Change where the cursor is. Yeah. Because otherwise, if you automatically like switch the input or whatever, or mask the current input with a different input, the browser is like, oh, there is no input, and then it pushes it to the front.
So from a view perspective, like where would we have that code? The code that like changes the cursor based on where the cursor currently is and what the new value versus the old value of the input is.
I mean, you can do it in different ways. Like you can do it in a method. Like if you are listening to specific input key events, then it would just be triggered via a method. So whenever someone like types a thing, then the method gets triggered each time. And you want that to happen because you want that update to happen on the fly. Another way you could do it is also you could create some kind of a watcher. So if you're like, oh, I have this data property like called formatted, and anytime I make updates to it, I want something else to happen. You can create a watcher for that specific property so that it adds additional logic without adding clunk to the rest of your like formatting code, for instance, because you want to create that differentiation of where things are happening. When I worked on input masking,
that would be a watcher on the computed property.
It'll be a watcher,
or a watcher on what the user has input.
No, it's what the user is inputting. So like it's not really a computer. So it's two different ways of dealing with it. So like if you're not using computer properties and you're just using a data property, like pure like whatever data, and then you can create a watcher on that data property and then update that specific thing, which like it can cause like conflicts, just like weird things to happen. Because again, you're like making changes to the thing you're changing, if that makes sense. Because you're
making changes to the thing you're changing. So you're saying like if you're watching something and the watcher changes the thing that you're watching,
yes,
then like you could end up in an infinite loop.
Yeah, you could end up just like, yeah.
One disadvantage of the watcher approach, like if the watcher is actually changing, if you're watching the computed property or the, what the user has actually input rather than what's showing up.
Yeah.
If you modify either of those, then you'll end up in an infinite loop. That's one caveat with a watcher versus, just having a method and a callback on an input listener, for example.
Yep, exactly.
Okay. And the input listener, I think the disadvantage of that one is it wouldn't have access to the old value, right?
Yes, correct. Unless you saved it somehow.
Actually, no, it would have access to the old value.
Well, if you do, you would have to query whatever is within that input element.
Yeah, so you'd check like the event target value, and that would be the new value, and it wouldn't be in your data yet or in your computed.
So interestingly,
and you decide what to do with it. Yeah,
there's a lot of like edge cases when you're dealing with input elements, which is just like an issue with inputs on the web in general, which is that and this is a decision that you have to make when you're doing input masking. For instance, like, do you want to capture paste events? So if someone were copying, pasting a password, for example, like how do you handle formatting that? Or how do you handle what exactly will happen? Or how do you validate that paste data? So let's say your input only accepts numbers. So it's like a phone number, and it only should accept numbers because a phone number doesn't have letters, theoretically. And one way of doing that is through validation. So you're always checking whenever a user is typing that key code is not an alphabet or a letter, it is a number. And it's also not a symbol. And that can be challenging in and of itself because you're checking character codes or key codes each time a user types. But it is additionally difficult when you're dealing with paste data, because when someone does a paste, that is not captured through input. And so you have to create like a different input event that grabs the data that was pasted and then checks whether it's alphabetized or not, and then whatever.
Oof. Can we drop a link in the show notes to a blog or something that explores those issues?
Yes, we can. I'll have to find one, because I had this issue and like was stuck in my own infinite loop of trying to figure out what exactly to do with this use case.
There's something that I've looked up at one time. I'll see if I can find it.
Okay. The other thing alongside like this weird validation thing, which is kind of this part of input masking is validation, is handling key press events. So we keep talking about key press events. The funny thing is that delete is has a really weird character code that isn't, I think when I dealt with it, I need to look at the exact code, but when I was trying to deal with grabbing delete or enter, I wasn't able to grab it using just traditional input. I needed to like actually use key press. And then
so are we talking like Mac OS delete or like Linux Windows delete key?
Well, Mac OS delete and Windows, yes.
Because Mac OS delete is basically backspace.
Yeah, it's backspace.
Yeah, yeah. Whereas delete on Windows and Linux on basically non-Mac OS keyboards.
Yeah.
Or non-Mac keyboards, that deletes the character in front. So
yeah, exactly. So yeah, there's that issue that you have to also consider. And I'll drop in the show notes this terrible code that I wrote for it.
Sounds good.
But it was just like the idea of essentially when I was doing input masking, I had to format and then unformat what I was doing. And the reason to do that is like every time I format something and I need to get the raw value, I would unformat it to get the raw value. So I didn't have two data attributes. I have one, and then I would just format and unformat it as I need. So anytime I press send, for example, I unformat everything I've done and then send it, which is not perfect. But yeah, there's like some terrible regex things as well, which is terrible. Because specifically what the input mask I was dealing with had to do with currency conversion, because that's a difficult thing to handle based on types of currency. So decimal places in currency are not standardized across different currencies. So in the US, it's like you use a point. In Europe, you use a comma.
In some countries, yeah.
And some other countries. In India.
Like Germany.
Like Germany, yeah. Germany and I think Spain does the same thing. Mm-hmm. And in India, there's a very specific type of, it's usually like 00 or whatever. And also thousands are, every three denominations, like it's just 1,000 denominations. But Indian currency has a weird like denomination system, which to me doesn't make any sense. And so I had to write a separate use case for that, because like anytime you wanted to do, I think that's a general problem on the web. Like I've seen so many different libraries to do currency conversion, not specifically a conversion, but the input masking for currency.
I think the only global problem that's more of a headache than currencies is maybe time zones.
Oh gosh, yeah, time zones is rough too.
I hate time zones.
It's funny you brought that up because I've recently, this is totally a side note, but I've been dealing with writing my own JSON web tokens just as an exercise to be like writing a JSON web token and then setting it in a cookie, specifically for role-based authentication on Netlify or role-based redirects in Netlify. And the time zone for JWT, the expiry needs to be in UTC. Mm-hmm. But for some reason on Netlify, it gives me ISO. Mm-hmm. So I keep getting an error. So I have to sucker punch this date into doing exactly what I needed to do. But yeah.
Got it. To convert it. Yeah, you have to like toString, then new date, and then work. Stay that way. You have to trick it somehow.
Yeah, it's weird. Like, I think this is something I need to explore further. But in Netlify, for some reason, I found that if you try to use a date, it just automatically converts it to ISO.
Okay.
So even if I do new date, I'm like, this is a const. It should never change. And it's a new date. And then I console log it's ISO. I'm like, all right, this is strange. And it might be due to just certain things that are happening that I don't know the build bots are doing. Yeah. I work at Netlify, but I'm no expert.
Got it. So another strategy that I've seen sometimes and use myself is having like a hidden input and then having users like not type into the input directly. Instead, they're typing into something else that is maybe like content editable.
Oh, yes.
So that like you can have full control over it and, add some characters like in between their characters, which you can't do in a normal input if you don't want them to be able to edit it. And sometimes if you don't want to mess with their cursor. Yeah. So this way, like you don't have to deal with some of those cursor edge cases. Mm-hmm. Have you used this strategy at all?
Let me see. Have I? I don't think I have. Content editable. I have not. But that's actually really, that's an interesting point. That will probably remove a lot of issues with events not doing exactly what you think they are doing and so on.
I mean, it does introduce some of its own issues as well, because inputs are made for inputting things, and they work generally very well for that. And reinventing some of that with content editable, you end up having to learn how to do some things that you already knew how to do with inputs over again.
Yeah, because content editable is just like you can use a P or a div or a span or whatever. So there isn't like the inbuilt event handlers that input gives you out of the box.
Yeah, gosh, I don't remember. It's been a while since I've solved this specific problem, but I remember there was some new stuff I had to learn. And we'll drop a link to the show notes. We're not going to go into too much detail in this anyway, because we don't want to get stuck in the weeds and have you try to visualize code in your brain while you're listening to this in the car and trying to like weave through traffic. And so that's one option. And it introduces some of its own complexity, but gets around a lot of the limitations of inputs or text areas.
Yes. Yeah, definitely.
Actually, like while we're here, I'd love to talk about some more of our like favorite form tricks. Do you mind if we share some of those?
Yeah, we can.
Gosh, one that I just thought of that I really like is auto-sizing text areas.
Oh, yes. That is really nice.
So they start out as just like one or two rows, and then they actually expand as the user types more. So they don't have to like have like three rows and then scroll to see the huge message that they've typed. Mm-hmm. And you probably have seen a lot of examples of this. I'm talking to the user here. I know you have, Divya. Like on Facebook, they have some of this. Like on GitHub, they have some of this. So that you start typing something and it expands at least to a certain extent, and sometimes almost indefinitely as you keep typing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Obviously, it can expand beyond the height of the screen. Well, actually, it could, but sometimes you don't want to because you have like other things that you want to always be present on the page.
Yeah. Is it like text boxes that you can also use that has the draggable thing? So anytime you type into it, you can just make the input bigger. I mean, that's not exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, I'm talking about like there's an NPM library that I often use for this that works well with Vue. I'm just going to Google npm autosize because that's what I usually do when I need it. I think it is just called autosize. Yep. Autosize is a small standalone script to automatically adjust text area height to fit text. And we'll drop that in the show notes. Cool.
This episode is sponsored by Sentry.io. Recently, I came across a great tool for tracking and monitoring problems in my apps. Then I asked them if they wanted to sponsor the show and allow me to share my experience with you. Sentry provides a terrific interface for keeping track of what's going on with my app. It also tracks releases so I can tell if what I deployed makes things better or worse. They give you full stack traces and as much information as possible about the situation when the error occurred to help you track down the errors. Plus, one thing I love, you can customize the context provided by Sentry. So, if you're looking for specific information about the request, you can provide it. It automatically scrubs passwords and secure information, and you can customize the scrubbing as well. Finally, it has a user feedback system built in that you can use to get information from your users. Oh, and I also love that they support open source to the point where they actually open sourced Sentry if you want to self-host it. Use the code devchat at Sentry.io to get 2 months free on Sentry's small plan. That's code devchat at Sentry.io.
What are some more of your favorite form hacks for more usable forms and just things that improve the experience quite a bit? Do you have libraries or tricks, tools that you use and pretty much every single app that has forms?
Yeah, I think I usually like to notify. So there have been times where I've worked on large forms, really large and long paginated forms. And the problem with those kinds of forms is that, going back to what we talked about at the beginning, just the idea of people finishing them because they're very long. Surveys is one example when someone has to go through multiple pages. And so the idea of having things happen as a person fills out a form, because when I'm filling out a form, my biggest worry is that I'll accidentally close the tab and then all of my data wouldn't be saved. And then I have to restart from the beginning. And so one thing that I like to do...
I've done that before where I've accidentally closed a tab and be oh no, I put in so much stuff. And sometimes if it's a conference proposal, I might have typed in my abstract and that's the only place because I was just thinking of it as I went.
Yeah.
And so, I've lost it. I have to rewrite it.
Yeah. So I've seen places where you can save things to local storage or to a specific user session. And so as someone is typing, you can save that data locally. And so if they were to close their tab, the data is saved. And when they come back, that's a behind the scenes trick, which is really nice. But you can also make it more explicit. So as you're typing, as a user is filling out a form, you can give them feedback to be oh, this is your this much done, or a progress bar, or to say to show that things are being saved as you're typing, rather than having them worry that they have to do it within a specific amount of time, or if...
Yeah, otherwise they get anxious. Yeah, especially if you don't have a save button, having some kind of indicator that things are saved automatically is really helpful. Otherwise, I will hunt for that save button because I'm so afraid of losing.
Yeah, I just command S by default always, which is really irritating.
Which usually saves the page,
Yeah, it saves the whole web page. It's do you want to save this web page? I'm no, that's not what I meant. I just wanted to It's interesting because I use paper, Dropbox's paper a lot, and it's not a form. It's just a giant Dropbox, a giant document that you can edit. And I command save on that all the time, but it's a web page, so you're not saving. But the nice thing about that is that when you do a command save, they give you a notification saying hey, all of your data is automatically saved. You don't have to save it explicitly. And so that feedback is always, I still hit command S and save.
Yeah, because you don't want to lose.
Because I don't want to lose, especially if I'm writing something, and I'm putting a lot of thought into something, I don't want that to just disappear into the ether. So, but it's a really nice feedback loop when the form or the app that you're using tells you that, hey, don't worry about it, your data's being saved. And I like the save and exit the best out of most forms. So TurboTax does it. For people who are not American or who don't reside in America, TurboTax is just tax preparation software that a lot of Americans use to complete their taxes. And taxes are generally terrible and dreadful, and nobody looks forward to that time unless you're an accountant or a CPA or whatever, or if you enjoy that. But the process of it is is simplified with TurboTax. So you still have to go through those different steps of filling out your forms, but TurboTax gives you that pat on the back as you're filling things out. It's like, hey, don't worry about it. Everything is going fine. We're saving things. And it has this special button, which I love, called Save and Exit. So you can exit an application and save the data. And I've seen not just TurboTax do this, but a couple of other forms do this, where if you get tired or if you have to move on to a different task and you can't finish a form, you can always save and exit. And so it saves it to your specific user profile or session. And you can always just return to it later, which is nice.
Yeah, that is nice. I really like those touches. And I think even in normal like comment boxes, like I find that really helpful when I notice it happens. Like on GitHub, if you type something in and then you refresh the page, like
it's still there.
Yeah, it'll still be there. So you won't have lost like that whole thing that you've written.
Yes. Yeah. That's pretty nice.
And they probably save that in local storage.
Yeah, likely. And then when you submit, they just clear it out.
Yeah.
Which is cool. The other thing that I use on forms, I guess another trick is help text. And it feels very stodgy because people don't really like a lot of information if you already have a lot of information on a page. But help text is hidden information. And so it only shows users that if they click on it or if they hover on it. And it's just additional context to a specific field that you're filling in. So there was a time where I was working on real estate software, and I'm not a real estate expert, so I don't know most terminology. There's a lot of terminology around real estate. And so one of them is like
selling,
like specifically there's one called pro forma, and if you ask me to explain what that means, I still have difficulty, but we had a specific field for pro forma information, and a lot of users might not know what that is. And so
they're also called reverse market rates, I think.
Did you just Google that?
No, I just made it up.
Okay.
And now they are sometimes called that because I just called it that.
Yeah.
So it's a statement that makes itself true.
There you go. I feel like if you say something with certainty, people believe you. And so
me specifically, or just
no,
anyone
in general. No, you're not special, Chris. It's just in general.
I like to think I'm special. I don't know. I like to think I'm especially good at speaking confidently.
There you go. I mean, that's the key. But anyway, to come back to the point, specific things might not make sense to people because there's always language that doesn't translate well if you are not an English speaker, or if you're not in that specific industry, you might not know the terminology. And so help text is really useful for giving users feedback as to what exactly they're filling in. It's kind of like having a personal assistant, the person you can nudge, being like, hey, what do I put in this field? And it's out of the box, it's there. And so as someone's filling in, they're like, what does this mean? And then they can click on the help text, and then it shows you, this is what you do, or this is an example of what this is. And you might have come across this, especially with CVV numbers with credit cards. So when you're filling in your credit card information, CVV is the number that's on the back of your card, usually it's like on a strip.
Yeah, it's like 3 characters.
And it's 3 characters. Yeah, and so there are certain...
Like 1, 2, 3, which is definitely not my CVV.
Not 3, 2, 1. And so there are lots of checkout forms where when they have the CVV input box, there's like a little I, which is usually denoted for help text. And when you click on it, it shows you an image. Some of them show you images. Some of them just say, hey, it's a 3-digit code on the back of your credit card. Some of them actually show a credit card and they're like, this is where it is. I've seen similar for like account and routing numbers for banks, because most people don't have access to that information on hand. They're like, where on earth do I find this number? And it's usually on your checks. And they'll circle like, this is where your account number is, and this is where your routing number is. So if you pull out your checkbook, you can know exactly where that is.
That's really helpful for, I remember when I was learning to be an adult, I found that those kinds of touches really useful.
Yeah.
It's like, how does this whole money thing work?
Yeah.
So people are going to give me money, and then I keep it. The bank keeps it.
Someone needs to create an illustrated guide to adulting. like all the different things you need to do, specifically and it'll mostly be finance oriented because
if someone created that, like I feel like Rachel Neighbors would be the best person in the world to create that resource.
Yeah, there you go. Collaboration.
If you don't know Rachel Neighbors, you should check out her talk at ViewConf last year. Really, really good. Really one of the favorites of the conference.
She also does
view animation, and she does so much cool stuff. Yeah,
she does trainings as well. So I just bought a course of hers, which is like cartooning for developers or something. I forget what it's called, but it's the idea of like how do you, as developers, you have a lot of technical knowledge, and you might want to translate that, and cartooning is one really great way of doing that. Or like,
where's this course? Has it started already?
No, it's just it's not
like an online thing.
It's just an online thing.
So it's not live.
Add the link. Yeah, it's not live. So I bought it and I have it, and I'm just like going through it slowly.
Definitely drop that in the show notes because that sounds interesting to me.
Yeah, it's super cool. I think she uses the same software that Webpack does for teaching their courses. I forget what it's called.
But anyway, back to these forms.
Yes, practical cartooning for technical folk. That is what it's called.
Oh, okay.
Very nice.
So, but before I sidetracked you, you were talking about how it's really helpful when they put like
help text,
little help text or images.
Yeah.
And I've even seen like credit card forms sometimes that actually look like a credit card.
Oh yes, I've seen those. Yeah, I find those just like cool, but not super
and as you're typing it in, they'll like put in the logo of your credit card. So when they've detected this is a Visa.
I've seen that. I've also seen that. Yeah.
So one of the other things that I'm curious about, you talked briefly about multi-page forms before.
Yeah.
You know, so sometimes there's like a lot of information that people want to put in. And in my experience, if you ask people to fill out like 30 fields, what will happen is that they just won't.
Yeah.
Especially in certain contexts, like depending on the context. Like especially if it's like a sign-in form, the sign-in form with 30 fields, unless they are highly, highly motivated to sign up for your site, they're just going to bail because people don't want to take that kind of time.
Yeah, definitely.
And so sometimes it's useful to only show people like a few fields at a time. If you have 30 fields, that's probably a bit too much, but like often it's useful to show people maybe like 3 different fields at a time, and they can go to like the next stage. And sometimes that has much better success at getting people to like stay and fill out the form. Mm-hmm. You'll notice that like a lot of surveys do this. Most surveys don't have like everything all on one page. They'll spread things out between pages so that you can submit little bit by little bit.
Yeah. I think the idea is just grouping content. So you're grouping related pieces of content together. So you're like, this is everything related to, if it's a survey, this is everything related to your personal information or like your demographic information. And then this is specific to like your views on a specific topic, whatever that may be.
But technically speaking, like how do you make that work? Let's say you have an endpoint like on your API to submit all of this information together.
Yeah.
But you can't have a form element that has like
I see
pages. Like
because it's like I see what you mean. I know what you mean.
Like even if it's client side, if you're just swapping out the elements, like you're losing that information, right? So how do you maintain it?
Yeah, that's always a hard part. So what I've done, I mean, this is definitely not answering your question at all, but in the past,
thanks for that.
when I've had multi-page forms, we just had endpoints that we would hit every time a user like moves to the next page.
So it saves some of their information?
Yeah, because otherwise it's like, I mean, you could theoretically try to save it to like a Vuex store or to like local storage of some form.
Got it.
And then like grabbing all of those. So what I've done and what I have played around with is having like a giant form data attribute, which is an object. And then within that, you have all of the various associated data properties within that form. And so all of them are null. And then as a user submits information in their form, you're just saving it. And it's saved to like a Vuex store or whatever. And then
that totally does answer my question, actually.
Yeah. So like when someone submits, then you just send the whole form thing down.
So in the first part of the form, like let's say you're not doing it in Vuex. In the first part of the solution, you mentioned like for the first section, you do a create.
Yeah.
And then in every other section, you do an update.
Yeah, essentially. Yeah.
And after it's already been created. So like if this thing actually exists already, like if it already has an ID, then in the first part, you do an update too.
Mm-hmm.
Like if people are going back to that section.
Yes, correct.
Okay. So that makes sense. So that's one way to solve it, you know, without having to like actually make sure that these things are on the same page or, keeping them within the same form element and trying to submit it all at once. Let's say for some reason, and I've come across this before, you do have to submit it all at once and there are going to be problems if you don't, because, you know, maybe there are validations that require like having all the information together.
Yeah.
Like server-side validations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's hard because in a sense, like you would want to do client-side validation to prevent for that. So you're like, okay, the server expects this information. And so you can have client-side validation that sits in the middle. So as a user is typing, you're doing that validation to make sure that it matches what the server expects. And so that way, when you submit the form in bulk, whatever the server gets is what it expects. And so it hits that form validation on the server side, but then you get fewer errors.
Are you saying like one limitation of this is like, if you submit it all at once, you'll get validations for like what went wrong, like server-side validation.
Yeah, so that's
only after they've submitted everything and they can't even see all the fields at that time, like in their view.
Yeah, so that it tends to be, I mean, that's also one reason why people get frustrated when they fill out forms, when people only do server-side validation, because if you only do server-side validation, then users can input can add and update 30 fields, and then they'll only be notified of like the fields that didn't work when they submit, which could be everything. And at that point, they wouldn't want to go back and fill out those 30 forms or update those 30 forms again.
So in these cases, it could be important to have like client-side validations wherever possible.
It also goes back to my point on why sending a form in bulk is problematic, because there are some things, for example, if you wanted to create a new user, like a new username, and you have to check the server to make sure that like no one else has used that specific username.
Yeah.
But you don't want to know that at the end. Like you want to know that up front. And
so you could have an endpoint that just like checks to see if this username is available.
Yeah, exactly. So you can do specific validation. So as a user is typing in, you're checking certain fields that need access to the database to be validated. And that doesn't need to be everything, of course. But of course, doing it this way prevents further errors down the line or for like more frustration and fewer errors for the user, because I'm more likely to update a field if the field is read while I'm typing it, rather than if I already finished and moved on, because your context has switched at that point.
I also ran into a case where there was like a very specific deadline for when we wanted to release this like feature, and it was a sign-up feature. And they definitely wanted to have this like multi-step sign-up process. Mm-hmm. And we couldn't do any validations like what you just described, which like would have solved the problem. You know, to check to see if this email address has been used or this username is available, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
We would really just find out at the end. And so what we did is we had the different groups show up with a V show.
Yeah.
And so we had things appear and disappear with V show, and transition through that. And then after they'd submitted it and we got validations back, we showed them all the fields together with validation errors, in one big page. So, and that was the edit page. So like editing the page and fixing validation errors is all consolidated on one page. But, getting people to fill out that information initially is much easier, right? Because, they're only exposed to so much information at a time and they're not overloaded.
Yeah, that makes sense. So at the end, it's like it just batches all of the things that need to be updated, essentially.
And in this case, it wasn't an option to, have those endpoints because that was a separate team.
Yeah.
And that team was like, oh yeah, they could probably get back and create that for us in 2 weeks. And it's like, oh wow. It's like, and sometimes you're using APIs that you don't even control.
Yes, exactly. It's always nice. when I was working on the multi-page form that I was mentioning, I was working alongside, literally next to the API team. And so it was easy for me to just nudge them on the shoulder asking for new endpoints because we worked very closely. And so for me, I was like, hey, from a user perspective, this would make more sense. And then they would be able to spin up an endpoint and I would be able to use it within the hour.
That is nice.
Which is a luxury that not all teams have.
Yeah. And this is, at least for a lot of apps, this isn't feasible for every app, before people jump down my throat. But in a lot of cases, I like to have mono repos where the same people can, update backend code and front-end code.
Yeah.
So that like when they need an endpoint like this, they can create it like in the same, PR, if not the same commit.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it comes from the same person rather than having to coordinate between multiple people, especially when it's something simple.
Yeah.
Or it's like, we just need this one endpoint to tell us whether or not this username is available. To get around some of this stuff, I've also seen hacks sometimes where users will actually like visit their website and check to see if a certain user profile exists or if it 404s. And just checking the head and knowing from that whether the username is available. I would try to avoid hacks like that whenever possible. But sometimes, I mean, come on, as web developers, especially like, I've worked on tons and tons and tons of different projects for tons of different companies. And you do run into cases like this where it's like, sometimes that might be the best solution for your current constraints and you can revisit it later. But technically right now, like it works and it's not causing a problem.
Yeah.
The only problem it might cause is like in your Google Analytics or something. You might be wondering, it's like, why are we getting so many 404s on user profile pages? Do we have some broken links somewhere?
Yeah.
But there are ways to work around that too, with specific refers and stuff like that.
Referrals.
Yeah. So I think we have time for like one more form hack if you have one.
If I have one?
Yeah.
Let's think.
If you don't have one, I think that's okay. I think we could wrap up.
I don't have one off the top of my head. I feel like I came in super cold to this.
Oh, yeah. For people listening, I think it's important for you to know. We had a scheduling mix-up, and so we didn't have the guest that we were planning to have today. So Divya and I decided, like, well, we still want to do an episode. Let's make something up. And, it's something Divya is really passionate about and something that, I work a lot on is like forms. And, we started off talking about form input masking.
Mm-hmm.
And then the conversation, because you were here, if you've made it this far, you were there. It kind of evolved and we talked about a bunch of other different form tricks. So that's probably what this episode will be titled.
Yes. Also, I just wanted to make a plug. So there's a book called Form Design Patterns on Smashing Magazine. And it's more taking the approach of building forms from a UX angle. So it goes through different use cases of how to build forms, like whether it's a registration form, a checkout form, a login, or filter, so on. But it goes over things to think about as you're building a form, just like from a usability and accessibility perspective, which I think is really useful because like implementation details aside, you ultimately have to build a form that is usable from a user perspective. And so there's lots of things to consider. Like, for example, one of the tricks, it's not really a trick, but one of the things that is noted in the book is the idea of where to put your label of your input and the success of where that label is and the correlation of that with users finishing a form or user satisfaction overall. And so like the trick essentially is that instead of putting labels like to the right or to the left, you should put it to the top, like right on top of and to the right of your input. So it's like name and then it shows you the input. I've also heard like mixed feedback on whether or not it is good to, there's certain forms where like there's an input box and instead of having a label, the label is in the input itself as a placeholder.
Oh, and then you click on it and then
you click on it and then it moves.
Yeah.
And I've heard both sides of the argument where people have said it's great because then you can save space and it's like a nice animation. And I've heard the other side, which is like it's really annoying because things are constantly moving as you're filling a page because there's always like, the reflow that happens.
I've seen this argument happen.
Yeah.
What I recommend in these cases is if people really feel strongly about it, like try both of them out. Like this is a great opportunity to A/B test.
A/B test.
And if it's something like a form and you're thinking about optimizations like this, then it's probably some kind of sign up form or something else where like retention is really important and you're trying to make things easier for people.
Yeah.
So like if that's the case, if it is actually important, A/B test it, and then you'll know for your users. And I've seen it come out like both ways.
Yeah. There's lots of people who talk about the optimal design of a form, but I think usually with forms, it's dependent on the use case. And like A/B testing is the best way to do that because every form is different, even though like it might be the same type. So it's like, yeah, it's a checkout form. Checkout forms on one page might not be the same on another. And so there's different tricks that you might want to try that might work for you and not for other people. So
cool. Actually, there's one more thing that I think I want to mention, and maybe more than one more thing. So this is something that isn't necessarily specific to Vue, but it's something I use all the time. And that's when you want to run some client-side validations on submit, on a form, you can add a vonListener submit.prevent to prevent default.
Yes. Yep.
And that way, when the form submits, it won't actually submit. And instead, you're catching when the submit happens, and then you can run those validations. And if they pass, then you can submit the form. Otherwise, you can show the client-side validations. Yeah. Or you can, run, hit some of those endpoints, to do specific validations.
Yes, that's a good thing to note, actually. I always forget to mention that when I talk about forms as well. Because I find that the default submit isn't as, like, I like the fine-grained control of doing submit.prevent and having my own submit event. So I can use Axios or whatever I want to use to do that specific post. And then I can handle errors as they come through rather than have the form do its own thing, relying on HTML to do its own error validation, which can be a bit tricky sometimes.
Yeah. Do you ever use built-in HTML validations?
For some, yeah. So like, for instance, if I'm...
For like the required attribute? Do you ever use that?
Oh, I haven't used required. I've used max limit before or max length. Mm-hmm. So like, I want a specific input to only have a length of this. So if it's a zip code is always 5 digits.
Got it.
Yes, it's 5 digits.
For those listening at home, on the video, Divya adjusted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on her fingers to count the digits in a zip code.
I'm not from I've lived in the US long enough that I should know this by now.
You should know numbers? Did they not have numbers in Singapore?
No, because zip codes are different. So
zip codes.
Yeah.
Zip codes.
So they don't call it zip codes; they call it postal codes. But like the postal codes in Singapore.
Oh, I was just making fun of you for typing on your for counting on your fingers. Even though I do it too. Sometimes when I'm really tired, honestly, like even if I need to do like 6 plus 3, I'll do like 6, 7, 8, 9, and I'll count on my fingers. It's okay, 9.
Yeah.
And then I catch myself and I think like, come on, Chris, you can do this in your head. You don't need your fingers. You're a big boy now.
I'm not embarrassed. I use my fingers. Never my toes, but usually my fingers.
I never count that high. If I need my toes, I'm bringing out a calculator.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I use my hand to like do there's like the trick for the months, the number of days in the month.
Oh yeah. I always forget that trick though.
Yeah.
And also I never need it. I have a calendar.
You just know? Okay. I usually... Yeah, that's fair.
Like when I'm scheduling something, I just bring up my calendar and my calendar automatically knows what days are in what month.
Yeah, but sometimes like there's some... Yeah, that's a fair argument. I think usually like sometimes I just need to know if like on the fly, if February or if March, for example, has an extra day or not. Because I'm like, wait, today's the 30th. Does it mean tomorrow's April 1st? And I'm like, no, silly. There is March 31st. Because
far more often, I find myself needing to know like the 13th. Is that a Wednesday?
Oh yeah,
like,
yeah.
What day of the week
I want to know a trick for that. I bet there's a trick for that, but I just don't. I do know that like.
Well, it changes every year.
It moves one down every year. So like if your birthday was in Saturday, it will be Sunday, and then if it was Monday, it will be Tuesday. So it just moves one down.
I've been alive for 32 years and I've never noticed that. That
it moves one down?
Yeah.
Yeah, it moves one down.
Never noticed that.
So yeah, that's why, because VueConf last year was 26, 27, 28. And then this year it's 25, 26, 27, because it's usually Monday through Wednesday. And so the dates.
And so eventually it'll be the previous year. We'll have to have 2 VueConfs in a single year, or like it'll start going back in time. It's like we've already had that VueConf actually.
Wait, what?
Because it keeps going back in time.
Wait, oh, because it keeps moving forward.
My joke didn't make sense. We don't need to analyze it. But let's move on.
This episode is brought to you by TripleByte. Applying to programming jobs sucks. You have to put the right keywords in your resume. You spend hours and hours on the phone screens and take-home projects, and that's assuming the company even responds to your application. Well, if you're a software engineer, TripleByte can help. They work with over 400 top tech companies, from big names like Dropbox and Adobe to exciting startups. You do one brief online interview with them, and if you do well, you go straight to final interviews with the company on their platform. It's like the common app for software developers. TripleByte does not look at your resume or where you went to school. All they care about is if you can code. I've helped dozens of software developers with various credentials get jobs, and this looks like a terrific way for you to get in and get interviewed and get a job without a lot of the hassle and overhead. You can go check them out at triplebyte.com/view. That's triplebyte.com, byte as in 8 bits. As a special offer for listeners of this show, if you take a job through TripleByte, they'll offer you a $1,000 signing bonus.
We should probably wrap up. Should we do our picks?
Yeah, we can do picks. Do you want to do picks?
Yeah, I would love to. Are you asking me to go first?
Yes.
Okay. My first pick is maybe a game that I've been playing a little bit of lately called Stardew Valley, which is just a very slow, meditative sort of like farming simulator and community building game, where you're just like going and I like remember people's birthdays, which I never do in real life. And then I give people like little gifts that I research and I figure out like, oh, what would they really love? And I give them something that they would love in their birthday. And then I get friendship points.
That's cute.
And then the better friends that I get with people, like the more I get to know them, the more of their character, the more their character like evolves, which is really cool. And then I also get to sort of in a relaxed way, just like build crops, manage a farm, name my animals and, pet them and milk them. And I have a cat named MacGyver, both in real life and on my farm.
Oh, that's cute. Do they share personalities?
No.
Oh, well.
MacGyver in real life is much more ornery and much more whiny. I can see why, especially in the winter, because like he wants to go outside, but he's mad at us because we made it cold.
Did you say ornery?
Ornery, yeah.
Ornery. What is ornery?
He's like sort of mischievous.
Ornery. Okay, got it. Yeah, I somehow like thought with an H, and I was like, that's not a word. Okay, I know now. What
sort of like mischievous and irritable, maybe? I don't know.
Irritable is ornery.
But I associate with mischievousness too. But anyway, another pick of mine is, this is another like mental health one. When you're having a hard time, talk to people in your life. It doesn't have to be professionally, but talk to someone, because when you're feeling very alone and you're going through difficult life stuff, as we all do sometimes, it can be tempting to like not want to like bother people. It's like, oh, I don't want to bother people with my problems, and I don't want to. You don't want to have to like. You don't want people to feel like you're causing them a problem. But if you're feeling incredibly alone and you're hurting, there's not really a risk to reaching out and being vulnerable and sharing, because oftentimes like it makes your relationship stronger actually, and people feel more comfortable being vulnerable to you if you're vulnerable to them. But also like if you just bottle up and don't talk to people because like you're afraid of causing them a problem, then your relationship is going to deteriorate anyway. You'll be losing friendship points every day that you avoid people. Real friendship points, which matter more than Stardew Valley friendship points. And that's it. That's my mental health pick.
That's a good one. That last pick. My pick is a book that I started reading. I'm really late to the party, but I started reading The Book Thief, and it's wonderful. I don't read a lot of genres outside of science fiction. I tend to stick within science fiction just because I really like that genre a lot. And I guess maybe fantasy, because it tends to be within the same genre as science fiction for some weird reason. But I started reading The Book Thief, and it's wonderful. It's such a heartwarming story. And I've really been enjoying it. My first book of 2019. And my second pick is this bike light that I have called Fortified Bike Light. Well, it's by a company called Fortified Bikes. And the nice thing about these bike lights is that they are anti-theft. So they have a specific screw that you need a specific screwdriver to take off your bike, which is nice so that you don't have to take off. Because usually if you don't ride bikes, this will not make sense. But if you ride bikes, bike light theft is pretty common, where people just take the lights off of your bike, because when you park a bike outside, like your parts are exposed to everything. And people tend to steal bike parts. And so this specific light is fixed onto your bike and no one can remove it but you or anyone else with fortified bike lights, because you need that screwdriver. And so it's pretty nice because of that purpose, and it's like USB chargeable.
So it's like an exclusive thieves guild.
Yeah, it is.
Listen, if you want to steal these, you'll need to become a member yourself.
You have to find other people who use this specific bike light, find out where they park their bikes, and then anyway, it's really great. It's USB chargeable. Like I have 2 different battery packs. It comes in, you can buy them separately. And so you can charge them and then swap them out as they need. The one issue I would say off the bat is that in order to activate the light, you have to press front of the light. Is that the face?
Yeah, sure.
The problem with that is that if another bike is parked next to yours and accidentally presses on the face of your light, the battery drains really fast.
Oh, no.
Because it turns on the light. And like most people don't know how to turn off a bike light, or they don't care to figure it out.
Or maybe they'll think it's like a motion sensor and it'll just turn off by itself.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, there have been times where I've passed by a bike, seen the bike light on, and then tried to turn it off because I feel bad for whoever's bike that was.
Aw, you're a good person, Divya.
Yeah, but I'm usually not successful unless it's very straightforward, in which case, if it's like a switch, I'll just be like, all right, I'll turn this off.
You just like punch it in the face a few times, and if that doesn't work, you just move on.
Yeah, I mean, usually I'm like, is there a switch? Is there like something? And then if there isn't, I'll like walk away, because I don't want people to think I'm stealing a bike, even though I don't look like the kind who would steal bikes. Unfortunately, people profile. I don't fit that profile, thankfully, but yeah.
What do you think it is? Do you think you're just too short?
Why'd you gotta bring that up? No, it's because
she doesn't even look like she could get on this bike. She couldn't even reach the pedals. How would she do this?
I'm not that
She's fine.
No,
oh, come on.
I was actually going.
I think there would be a lot of bikes where you wouldn't be able to reach the pedals.
It's true. It's true. No, I was more going for, I just look like I wouldn't do that. Like I look very basic, normal, I guess.
Okay.
It works in my favor, so I'll take it. But yeah, that's all the picks I have for today.
I'm glad you appear unassuming.
Yes.
She is devious, though. Watch out for her, and she will steal your bike light. She has the special screwdriver. Beware.
All right. And with that, let's wrap up the show. It's been wonderful chatting with you, Chris.
Good talking to you, too.
Yeah. And meanwhile, enjoy the view.
Bye, everybody.
The end.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.